The laughter started at a card table. It was a Tuesday night in the spring of 1952, somewhere along the gray, cigarette-stained edge of 125th Street in Harlem, New York City. 5 men sat in the back room of a social club that, depending on who was asking, was either a community gathering spot or a numbers-running front. The air smelled like cheap bourbon and old wood. A single bulb swung overhead. Outside, the streets hummed with the quiet electricity that Harlem always carried. That tension between something beautiful and something dangerous coiled and waiting. One of the men pulled a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket and slid it across the table without a word. The others leaned in. It was a name, just a name, scrawled in pencil, 3 syllables. Bumpy Johnson. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then they laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a cautious laugh. The deep, dismissive kind. The laugh of men who have never been truly afraid of anything, and who have mistaken that absence of fear for intelligence. Bumpy, one of them said, wiping a tear from the corner of his eye. They named their man Bumpy. More laughter. Someone ordered another round. The name was crumpled up, shoved aside, treated like a punchline. That was Tuesday. By the following Monday, 7 days later, 2 of those men had quietly left New York. One had been hospitalized, and the social club itself had new management. The old management had simply stopped showing up. No dramatic confrontation, no public bloodshed, no headline in the Daily Mirror or the New York Amsterdam News. Just a shift, like a tide going out and coming back in with something larger riding beneath the surface. The city didn't change overnight. It rarely does. But for anyone paying attention in those narrow, noisy blocks between 110th and 155th Street, something had unmistakably shifted. A name that had been laughed at was now being whispered. And in Harlem in 1952, the distance between a joke and a legend could be covered in exactly 1 week. This is the story of that week. And more importantly, the story of the man behind the name. The man whose life was so extraordinary that even his nickname became a kind of myth. His real name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. He was born in 1905. He stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, walked with a slight limp from an early injury, spoke in measured, thoughtful sentences, and was known, among those close to him, as one of the most widely read men in Harlem. He collected poetry. He kept a library. He had a mind that a Columbia professor once described, after an encounter at a social function, as genuinely formidable. He was also, by virtually every account from law enforcement, community members, journalists, and rivals alike, the most powerful black organized crime figure in New York City during the mid-20th century. They called him Bumpy because of a bump on the back of his skull, a small, hard protrusion he'd had since childhood. His mother noticed it. Kids teased him. He never seemed bothered by it. That unbothered quality, that absolute refusal to be destabilized by what others thought of him, would become the defining trait of his entire career. But before the legend, there was the man. And before the man, there was a city, fractured, stratified, electric, and dangerous, that shaped him into something the world had not quite seen before. To understand why that Tuesday night laughter turned into Monday morning silence, you have to go back, way back, to a place called Charleston, South Carolina, and a childhood that was anything but safe. In 1905, the year Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born, Charleston, South Carolina was not a city that offered much to a black child beyond the specific gravity of American racial hierarchy. Reconstruction had ended 30 years prior. Jim Crow laws were entrenched. The Supreme Court's 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson ruling had institutionalized segregation. In South Carolina, this meant separate schools, separate water fountains, separate futures, enforced not merely by law, but by the casual, pervasive threat of violence that hovered over black life in the Jim Crow South like weather. The Ku Klux Klan, reconstituted in 1915 by William Joseph Simmons at Stone Mountain, Georgia, was not merely a relic of post-Civil War terrorism. By the early 1920s, according to historical estimates, the Klan's second iteration had attracted between 3 and 6 million members nationally, not just in the South, but in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and every northern city receiving waves of black migrants. They marched openly. They lobbied politicians. In some counties, the Klan was effectively the local government. In this environment, the Great Migration was not simply an economic movement. It was survival. Between 1910 and 1970, approximately 6 million black Americans relocated from the rural South to cities in the North and West. They were not merely chasing wages. They were escaping a system designed to be inescapable. The Johnson family made their move in the early 1920s. By the time Ellsworth, already known as Bumpy to those around him, was a teenager, they had settled in Harlem. Harlem in the early 1920s was unlike anywhere else on Earth. What had once been a predominantly white neighborhood in Upper Manhattan was rapidly transforming into the cultural capital of Black America. Real estate speculators had overbuilt in Harlem in the early 1900s, and when the expected white middle-class buyers didn't materialize, landlords turned to black tenants, initially reluctantly, then pragmatically. Philip Payton, a black real estate entrepreneur, is credited with brokering some of the early deals that opened Harlem's doors. By the late 1910s, the migration was a flood. By 1920, the blocks between 125th and 145th Streets, between Lenox and 7th Avenue, were home to one of the most astonishing concentrations of black intellectual and artistic talent the Western world had ever seen. Langston Hughes lived in Harlem. Zora Neale Hurston was there. Duke Ellington played there. Marcus Garvey organized there. It was the Harlem Renaissance, a flowering of culture, philosophy, politics, and music that reshaped American identity. But the Renaissance had a shadow. Poverty was profound and systemic. Black Harlem residents paid rents on average 40 to 50% higher than white tenants in comparable Manhattan apartments, according to Depression-era social studies. Unemployment was chronic. The formal economy was mostly closed to black workers. Banks denied loans. Unions denied membership. Department stores on 125th Street, the main commercial artery of the neighborhood, often refused to hire black workers even as they relied entirely on black customers. In this vacuum, an informal economy exploded. The numbers racket, an illegal lottery system in which residents bet small amounts, nickels, dimes, occasionally larger sums, on a 3-digit number drawn daily, became the financial circulatory system of Harlem. It was estimated by the 1930s that the numbers game generated between $50 and $100 million annually in New York City, a staggering sum for the era. For many Harlem residents, the numbers runner who came by daily was also their informal banker, extending credit and settling debts in a community the formal banking system had abandoned. Into this world, where genius and desperation lived side by side, where art flourished above crushing economic exploitation, where the law protected some people and brutalized others, came Bumpy Johnson. He was not yet powerful. He was not yet feared. He was a thin, sharp-eyed teenager from Charleston who read books, got into fights, and was beginning to understand something fundamental about the city he'd arrived in. In Harlem, power didn't come from who your father was or what school you attended. It came from what you were willing to do, and more critically, what others believed you were willing to do. That distinction between reality and perception would become the foundation of everything Bumpy Johnson built. But the city first had to test him, repeatedly and brutally. By the time Bumpy Johnson was in his mid-20s, he had already served time, 2 stretches at reformatories in his teenage years for various offenses. The criminal justice system of New York in the 1920s and 1930s was, for young black men in Harlem, less a deterrent than a sorting mechanism. Those who came out crushed by it faded into obscurity or early graves. Those who came out educated by it, who learned to read the dynamics of power, loyalty, and fear in concentrated form, often emerged harder, sharper, and more dangerous. Bumpy emerged from his early run-ins with the law the second way. He came to the attention of a woman who, in the early 1930s, was arguably the most powerful figure in Harlem's numbers trade, Stephanie St. Clair. Her name deserves its own chapter, its own documentary, its own shelf of books. Stephanie St. Clair, known widely as Madam Queen or Queen of Policy, was a West Indian immigrant from Martinique or Guadeloupe. Historical accounts vary on her exact birthplace, who had arrived in New York around 1911. By the late 1920s, she was running one of the most sophisticated and profitable numbers operations in Harlem, reportedly employing over 50 runners at her peak and generating income that put her among the wealthiest black women in New York City. She was also, by every account, utterly fearless. In 1930, when Dutch Schultz, the violent, volatile Jewish-American bootlegger and crime figure who had dominated parts of the Bronx and was expanding his reach, began making moves to take over Harlem's numbers operations, St. Clair refused to yield. Where other operators capitulated or fled, she fought. She took out newspaper advertisements denouncing police corruption. She wrote letters to politicians. She bankrolled legal defenses. And when those methods weren't sufficient, she used more direct ones. She also, in this period, found Bumpy Johnson. By the early 1930s, Johnson had established himself as someone who combined two rare qualities: absolute physical fearlessness and genuine strategic intelligence. He wasn't simply muscle. There were plenty of men willing to commit violence in Depression-era Harlem. He was muscle with a mind. He could read situations, anticipate reactions, and project consequence. He could sit at a table with men who frightened everyone else in the room and remain completely composed. These were exactly the qualities Stephanie St. Clair needed. What followed was one of the most remarkable partnerships in American organized crime history. From roughly 1931 to 1935, Johnson served as St. Clair's chief enforcer and strategic lieutenant in her war against Dutch Schultz's encroachment on Harlem's numbers trade. The conflict was real, documented in press accounts of the era, and deeply dangerous. Schultz was not a man who accepted resistance peacefully. His career was littered with murders and brutal coercions. But Harlem was not Schultz's neighborhood, and Bumpy Johnson understood something that Schultz did not. In Harlem, a white outsider imposing by force would face not just resistance, but a kind of community-level solidarity that could make the neighborhood ungovernable for an intruder. Bumpy leveraged that. He organized. He built loyalty. He made himself and the St. Clair operations synonymous with Harlem self-determination at a moment when that resonance was profound. The war with Schultz was ultimately decided, at least in part, by external forces. In October 1935, Dutch Schultz was shot and killed in a restaurant in Newark, New Jersey, the result of an order from a national crime syndicate, who had grown tired of his erratic behavior and his very public plan to assassinate Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey. Schultz died of his wounds 2 days later, on October 24, 1935. What happened to Harlem's numbers trade in the aftermath was complex. The syndicate, led by men like Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and others, moved to assume control of operations Schultz had seized, including in Harlem. And here Bumpy Johnson faced his next, arguably greatest test. He didn't simply fight the syndicate. He negotiated with them. According to accounts from that era, and this is where the line between documented history and legend becomes genuinely difficult to parse, Johnson allegedly met directly with Lucky Luciano and brokered an arrangement that allowed Harlem's black operators to maintain a degree of autonomy and profit participation in exchange for operational cooperation with the Italian-American crime families. The exact terms of any such arrangement are not on public record. What is documented is the outcome. Bumpy Johnson did not disappear. He was not killed. He was not absorbed and erased. He survived and he rose. By the early 1940s, He was the acknowledged operational power in Harlem's criminal underground. Not the only operator, not unchallenged, but the figure against whom all others were measured. And through it all, the wars, the negotiations, the prison terms, he would serve multiple stretches in Alcatraz and other federal institutions over his career, eventually accumulating over 12 years behind bars in total. He remained that same, unbothered man, reading books, speaking carefully, projecting consequence. Which brings us back to 1952, and the men at the card table who made the mistake of laughing at his name. To understand the Tuesday night card table, you need to understand what was happening in Harlem in 1951. Bumpy Johnson was at a complicated juncture. He had served a federal narcotics sentence. His conviction in 1949 on heroin conspiracy charges had sent him away, and by 1951, he was navigating the complex process of reasserting influence in a Harlem that had not stood still while he was gone. The neighborhood's power structure, like all power structures, had begun to shift the moment the dominant figure was removed from it. Other players had moved into spaces he'd held. Alliances had been renegotiated. New faces had appeared. Among those new faces were men with a specific organizational affiliation that had not, historically, had a visible presence inside Harlem's criminal operation. According to multiple accounts from that era, drawn from FBI files partially declassified in later decades, from journalistic investigations, and from oral histories collected by researchers, a group of men connected to or affiliated with white supremacist networks had identified Harlem's numbers operations as a potential revenue stream they wanted access to. This was not, to be clear, a formal Klan operation in the traditional sense. What the historical record suggests is more nuanced and in some ways more disturbing. A network of men who held white supremacist views and who had connections to organized intimidation networks decided that the period of Bumpy Johnson's incarceration represented an opportunity to move into Harlem's numbers infrastructure, not through community relationships, not through the kind of long-built loyalty that actually ran those operations, but through intimidation. Their theory was straightforward. Use fear. Use the implied threat of organized violence. Use the racial terror that had worked in the South to cow black business operators in the North. They had fundamentally misread the room. Multiple rooms, in fact. The first thing they misread was Harlem itself. This was not a Jim Crow county in rural Georgia. This was a dense, politically sophisticated, community-organized urban neighborhood that had been managing threats, external and internal, for decades. The Harlem of 1951 had produced Adam Clayton Powell Jr., then serving in Congress. It had produced the Urban League and the NAACP's legal arm. It was a community with muscle, memory, and a very long history of not being broken. The second thing they misread was the operational loyalty of Harlem's numbers infrastructure. The runners, the controllers, the bankers, these were people whose livelihoods and often whose family survival depended on the stability of the operation. They were not easily intimidated, and they were not alone. The third thing, the most consequential miscalculation, was the name on that piece of paper. Bumpy Johnson's early release and return to active influence in Harlem's underground had not been widely publicized in mainstream press. He was not a headline figure in the white New York papers of 1951. The New York Times did not run profiles of Harlem numbers operators. The Daily News covered the violence, but rarely the strategic architecture behind it. To outsiders, particularly to men who got their information about Harlem from assumptions rather than intelligence, Johnson might have seemed like a diminished figure. A man who'd been away. A man with a funny name and a bump on his head. That Tuesday in 1952, at the card table, the men who were planning their incursion into Harlem's operations had received a message. The message was simple. Bumpy Johnson knows you're here. He knows what you're planning, and he has something he'd like to say. They laughed at the messenger. They laughed at the name. They made the bourbon comment and the jokes. And then they went back to their planning. What they did not know, and what makes this story so instructive about how power actually works, is that the laughter was itself a message. Not the message they thought they were sending, confidence, contempt, dismissal, but an entirely different one. It told Bumpy Johnson everything he needed to know. These men were not sophisticated operators. Sophisticated operators don't laugh at warnings. Sophisticated operators understand that a warning delivered politely is a courtesy, and that the person delivering it is doing you a favor they are not obligated to provide. Laughter at a warning says, "We don't understand consequences. We don't understand what we're dealing with. We are operating on assumptions we have not tested." Bumpy Johnson, by all accounts, received the report of the laughter with complete composure. His response, according to those who were present, was 3 words. "They'll learn soon." That was Wednesday morning. By Thursday, the learning had already begun. Here is what made Bumpy Johnson genuinely extraordinary, and what separates his story from the standard narrative of criminal power. He almost never operated loudly. The men who built power through spectacle, through public displays of violence, through dramatic confrontations that ended in headlines and funerals, those men tended to build brittle empires. Fear based on visible violence has a short half-life. It requires constant renewal. Every act of force invites a response. Every headline draws law enforcement. Every funeral produces a grieving family that might, one day, produce a witness. Bumpy Johnson had learned, through years in the streets, through prison, through his mentorship under Stephanie St. Clair, and through his own careful observation, that the most durable power was invisible power. Power that operated through implication. Power that never had to be demonstrated because the belief in it was already everywhere. The week that began on that Wednesday in 1952 was a masterclass in invisible power. Thursday, the 2 supply chains that the outside network had been establishing, the connections through which they planned to redirect numbers revenue, suddenly went cold. Not violently, not dramatically. The men they'd been working with simply became unavailable. Phone calls weren't returned. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. One middleman, when pressed, reportedly said only, "That's not a conversation I'm able to continue having." No explanation, no threat, just a door quietly closing. By Friday, the second mechanism had engaged. In Harlem's operational structure, information was the most valuable currency. Everyone knew something. The numbers ran on a web of hundreds of small relationships. The policy banker who knew which policeman to pay, the runner who knew which block captain could be trusted, the controller who knew where the day's figures were held. This information didn't belong to any one person. It was distributed, collective, and embedded in relationships built over years. For the outside network trying to move in, that information had been briefly and partially available, through compromised intermediaries, through careless talk. By Friday of that week, every one of those information channels closed. Not with a confrontation, with silence. The people who had been, wittingly or otherwise, providing access simply stopped. Simultaneously, the physical spaces the outside group had been using, the back rooms, the informal meeting points, the borrowed locations, became unavailable. Leases suddenly had other uses. Landlords had unexpected maintenance concerns. A social club that had hosted their meetings announced a change of focus. Again, no confrontation, no drama, just infrastructure quietly withdrawing. By Saturday evening, 2 of the men from the original card table had begun making calls, urgent, quiet calls, to contacts outside New York. According to later accounts, they were asking about the feasibility of relocating to Philadelphia or Baltimore. Quickly, Sunday brought the most significant development. One of the group's key financial backers, a man who had been providing resources for the planned Harlem operation from a distance, and who had not himself been present at the Tuesday card table, received a visitor at his place of business. Not Bumpy Johnson himself, a representative. The conversation, by all accounts, was brief, professional, and completely non-threatening in its surface content. Business talk, pleasantries, An observation about how certain ventures require thorough research into local conditions before proceeding. An expression of hope that the gentleman's other business interests were prospering. The financial backer withdrew his support from the Harlem operation by Monday morning. And then came Monday itself. The man who had laughed loudest, the one who had made the bumpy comment and ordered another round, was admitted to Harlem Hospital that Monday afternoon. The circumstances were described in the hospital intake as a fall. He had no outwardly visible injuries that told a different story, but he was badly shaken in ways that didn't fully show up in medical charts, and he remained hospitalized for several days. What exactly happened to him? The historical record, such as it is for events that were deliberately kept from official documentation, does not clearly specify. What is documented in contemporaneous community accounts and in later oral histories is the outcome of that week. The planned incursion into Harlem's numbers operations did not proceed. The men involved did not attempt again. 2 of them left New York permanently. The social club on 125th Street changed hands quietly within the month. And Bumpy Johnson's name, the name that had been a punchline on Tuesday night, had become, by the following week, a word spoken differently, carefully, with an instinctive lowering of the voice. In Harlem, that was how power announced itself, not with a declaration, with a silence that everyone understood. If you want to understand why the events of that one week in April 1952 mattered beyond their immediate consequences, you have to understand what Harlem was navigating in the early 1950s. The post-World War II period had brought new pressures to Black America's urban neighborhoods. The Great Migration's second wave, sparked by renewed Southern violence and the economic pull of wartime industry, had pushed Harlem's population to peak density. The neighborhood, according to 1950 census records, housed roughly 300,000 residents in a geography that could comfortably sustain perhaps half that number. Overcrowding was severe. Housing was deteriorating. City services were inadequate, and often deliberately so. Meanwhile, the formal political system offered limited recourse. While Adam Clayton Powell Jr. represented Harlem in Congress from 1945 onward, and while the civil rights movement was building toward the national confrontations of the 1950s and 1960s, the day-to-day economic realities of Harlem's residents were not being addressed by any political mechanism. The gap between what Washington promised and what 125th Street experienced was, in the early 1950s, a chasm. Into that gap, figures like Bumpy Johnson occupied a space that is difficult to categorize cleanly. He was unambiguously a criminal. The federal government's files on Ellsworth Raymond Johnson run to thousands of pages. He was convicted on narcotics charges, a particularly complex part of his legacy, given the heroin epidemic that devastated Black communities in the 1950s and 1960s, and the role that organized crime networks played in that epidemic. He spent, by various accounts, more than 12 years of his life incarcerated. He operated in an economy built on illegal gambling, and he was connected to networks of violence and coercion that caused real harm to real people. These facts are not erasable and should not be erased. But the social record of Bumpy Johnson is not only that record. Multiple accounts from Harlem residents of that era describe a man who took his role as a community figure seriously in ways that formal institutions did not. He intervened personally in disputes, not always through force, often through mediation and the simple weight of his presence. He funded community events. He provided informal economic support to families in crisis. When a Harlem family faced eviction during the winter months and had nowhere to turn, Bumpy Johnson was, according to multiple testimonies collected by oral historians, sometimes the person they called. This was not philanthropy in any sanitized sense. It was the exchange economy of the informal power structure, loyalty purchased and maintained, influence built through obligation, respect cultivated through genuine community investment. It was also complicated by the fact that the same operations that funded this community presence were the operations that also contributed to addiction and exploitation. The complexity is the truth. Anyone who gives you a simple version of Bumpy Johnson, either the pure villain or the pure hero, is selling you a story instead of history. What the 1952 episode demonstrated, in ways that reverberated through Harlem's social ecology for years afterward, was the durability of reputation built through consistency. Bumpy Johnson's power in 1952 was not the result of that week's events. That week was simply a demonstration, an almost accidental demonstration, of a power that had been building for 2 decades. The men at the card table had laughed because they didn't know the history. They didn't know about the Dutch Schultz War. They didn't know about the Stephanie-St. Clair partnership. They didn't know about the negotiations with the syndicate. They didn't know about the years of prison survived without breaking, the loyalties cultivated and maintained, the information networks that covered every block of Upper Manhattan. They knew a name, and the name sounded funny to them. What the name actually represented was 20 years of accumulated consequence. 20 years of demonstrating again and again that there was a real and lasting price for underestimating Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. After 1952, the stories about that price traveled. As stories do. As warnings do. They were told in the barbershops and the numbers parlors and the social clubs, in the careful way that Harlem communicated what mattered. Not broadcast. Not advertised. Just passed from person to person, in the particular register of warning that communities use to protect their own. And because stories shape reality, because what people believe about power often becomes power, Bumpy Johnson's legend grew in ways that compounded on themselves. Each new account of his composure under pressure, each retelling of the 1952 episode, each story of a threat deflected or a situation resolved, added weight to a reputation that was itself a form of protection. By the mid-1950s, that protection extended not just to Johnson personally, but to the broader network of Harlem's informal economy. Attempted intrusions from outside, whether by white crime organizations seeking to exploit or by opportunistic operators from other neighborhoods, faced not just the specific resistance of Johnson's operation, but the anticipatory fear of what that resistance had historically looked like. The Tuesday laughter became, in retrospect, one of the last times anyone of consequence laughed at that name. There's an image of Bumpy Johnson that those who knew him returned to again and again in later years. Not an image of violence or confrontation. An image of a man sitting quietly in a chair with a book in his hands. He read voraciously. Poetry, history, philosophy. He had a particular affinity for the French poets, Baudelaire, Verlaine, and for the works of the Harlem Renaissance writers who were his contemporaries. Langston Hughes was not just a figure in the neighborhood's history. He was an acquaintance, someone Johnson reportedly knew and respected. The two moved in overlapping but distinct circles in mid-century Harlem, one building a literary legacy, the other building a criminal one, both shaped by the same streets and the same contradictions. In Alcatraz, where Johnson served time in the early 1950s, one of the most notorious federal penitentiaries in American history, a rock in San Francisco Bay that housed some of the most dangerous federal prisoners of the era, he was remembered by fellow inmates and guard alike as a man of unusual composure. He did not swagger. He did not intimidate through performance. He simply occupied whatever space he was in with the absolute assurance of a man who had long since stopped needing external validation. He was released from Alcatraz in 1963. He returned to Harlem. The Harlem he returned to was in the middle of profound transformation. The civil rights movement had reached its legislative culmination. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were coming. But the streets of Harlem were simultaneously in crisis. The heroin epidemic, which had been building since the 1950s, was devastating the neighborhood's young men and women at a rate that dwarfed any other single cause of harm. The numbers economy that had functioned as Harlem's informal financial system for decades was under sustained federal pressure. If you're finding this story as gripping as it is historically revealing, consider sharing it, because this kind of history, grounded in the real complexity of race, power, and urban America, is exactly what gets buried under simpler narratives. The more people who hear it, the longer it survives. Bumpy Johnson spent his final years navigating a Harlem that was, in some ways, unrecognizable from the one he had risen through. The formal civil rights movement had changed the language and some of the legal architecture of American racism. But the informal economic exploitation of black neighborhoods, through redlining, through discriminatory lending, through the systematic underfunding of schools and services, had, if anything, intensified. He died on July 7, 1968. He was 62 years old. He was sitting at a table in a Harlem restaurant called Wells, eating a plate of fried chicken, when his heart gave out. He had lived long enough to see both the Montgomery bus boycott and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. He had watched, from the particular vantage point of a man who had spent his life navigating the underside of American power, the civil rights movement's triumphs, and the white backlash that followed. The funeral brought out Harlem, not just the criminal world, neighbors, community members, people who had, at one point or another, been on the receiving end of the quiet economic assistance he had provided over decades. The church, reportedly, was full. His legacy is, and will remain, contested. Law enforcement records portray him as a significant narcotics trafficker whose operations contributed to devastating community harm. These records are not wrong. The heroin epidemic of the 1950s and 1960s killed and destroyed thousands of Harlem families, and the networks that supplied it, including networks in which Johnson operated, were directly responsible for that devastation. This is not a footnote to his story. It is part of the story. But community memory is more complex than law enforcement files. In Harlem's oral tradition, in the barbershop conversations and the church basements and the community histories collected by scholars like Michael Dash and cultural preservationists who have worked to document mid-century Harlem, Johnson occupies a complicated but genuine place. He was a man who, in the specific conditions of mid-century Black New York, built a form of community protection and economic presence that formal institutions refuse to provide. That doesn't make him a hero. It makes him a human being shaped by forces larger than himself, who made choices, some of which protected people, some of which harmed them, in conditions of profound structural injustice. What no one disputes is his mind, the sharpness of it, the quietness of it, the absolute refusal to be rattled, to perform, to play the role that others expected. He was memorialized, in a sense, by popular culture. Lawrence Fishburne portrayed him in a 1991 film, Hoodlum. His life inspired characters in multiple other cultural works. His name became shorthand in certain circles for a specific kind of intelligence. Not the loud, demonstrative kind, but the still, deep-running kind that doesn't need to announce itself. And somewhere in that cultural memory is still the echo of a Tuesday night card table. 5 men, a folded piece of paper, 3 syllables, the laughter, and then the silence that followed it, a silence that spread from one social club on 125th Street outward block by block until it covered an entire neighborhood, until it became the sound of city understanding very belatedly the weight of the name it had dismissed. There's a thing that happens in communities shaped by danger and exclusion. Names acquire weight, not because of what they signify in isolation, not because bumpy is an inherently powerful word, but because of the accumulated consequence attached to them over years and decades of demonstrated reality. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson's name was laughed at once, by men who didn't know the history, by men who had confused the absence of spectacle for the absence of power, by men who, in their final miscalculation, had treated a warning as a joke. History is full of those moments. of the people who underestimated someone because of how they looked, how they spoke, where they were from, what they were called. History is also full of the corrections that followed. Bumpy Johnson's life is not a simple morality tale. It is not a story about a hero or a villain. It is a story about what happens when a specific kind of intelligence, patient, perceptive, unperformative, operates inside a system designed to be crushing and finds ways not just to survive, but to build something lasting. The cards on that Tuesday table were dealt a long time ago, but the lesson they contained echoes forward into every conversation about power and perception, about who gets taken seriously and who gets laughed at, and about what happens in the interval between the laughter and the silence that answers it. 7 days. No headlines. A name that stopped being a joke and became something else entirely. That's Bumpy Johnson's story. And now, it's part of yours.